be mad at me for saying that, but I honestly believe that.
We are the Armed Attorneys. Today we're talking trauma kits. Should you carry one? Should you not carry one? What are the pros and cons of each of those? And how these things might show up in court criminally and civilly. But before we begin, show your support for the Second Amendment by hitting that like button. And trauma kits, I'd say probably more popular than ever.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's lots of sort of tactical medicine classes out there that'll teach you how to use one. They're cheap and easy to
very affordable.
find. Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think, we have this idea kind of out there in the ether that if you are ever in a situation, I mean, let's say that you're in a situation where there is a shooting around you, right?
Yep.
And maybe a stranger gets shot, maybe your wife or your child or, someone to that effect gets shot.
Yep.
You have that, compression seal, you have the tourniquet, you have the,
Packing.
the packing material, exactly, the gauze. You could potentially preserve someone's life until EMS gets there. It's very, very powerful. I mean, even just like a negligent discharge at the range, I mean, It could be life-saving, right? So you can see why they have become so popular recently, I think.
Yep. Why do you see folks carrying these things?
You want to save that life. But I don't think anyone thinks like, well, I might have to use my gun and then I'll use it. So it's not really a self-defense preparedness, right?
Right.
It's just emergency preparedness.
Yeah, I see folks carry them in their vehicles, car wreck. I see folks carry them in their range bags typically.
Yes.
I don't see typically folks carrying them out in public on their person, except for maybe law enforcement if they're on a SWAT team or something like that.
It's not like I'm going to go out running at night and I'm going to bring my pistol and my trauma kit. I mean, that's...
Well, you might. If you're that person, comment. I'm that person.
So I mean, I would say it's definitely emergency preparedness,
Yep.
not necessarily self-defense preparedness.
Right.
And that's where, I mean, when we look more towards self-defense, that's where I think trauma kits are not a good idea.
Yeah, they definitely might not be.
People would be mad at me for saying that, but I honestly believe that. If I have a client who gets in a self-defense shooting, I do not want them to have a trauma kit on their person.
Yeah, I think a good way to start would be like creating that baseline. You don't have a trauma kit.
Yeah.
Let's say, and the big downside to that is maybe you're less prepared for emergencies.
Sure.
Maybe you don't have the capacity to mitigate, somebody losing their life or...
maybe that person's very close to you.
Yeah. And so, there's definitely some downsides, but I think to your point of if you do have a trauma kit, I think the list of cons is kind of long.
It's long. So, let's talk about it. So, first of all, if you are in a self-defense situation, you have a trauma kit, say you have a trauma kit and you use it. Should we start there?
Yeah, let's see what happens.
So you have a trauma kit and you use it. If I'm a prosecutor, and Richard and I, of course, are former prosecutors, so we know how to think dirty. Not like, you know what I mean? But like we know like how to twist things against the self-defender. And I think that if I'm that prosecutor, I'm going to say, you shot someone and then you immediately ran over to save their life. You know what that says to me? Consciousness of guilt.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Right? You shouldn't have done that. You feel really bad and now you're going to go try to fix the problem.
Yeah, it's the same thing we see with folks not calling 911, running away from a scene. All these little elements could build up to, hey, you did something wrong and that's why you took XYZ action. I can definitely see that.
I don't, just to be clear, I don't believe that that's always going to be the case, but just we're playing the devil's advocate here, right?
Yeah, I think what would be more low-hanging fruit for a prosecutor is just say, this guy's a lunatic.
Right, yeah. He was just, that's their go-to, right? Anytime if you have more than one firearm on you, if you have anything unusual, it's going to be, this guy is a crazy nut job who was looking to get into a shooting situation.
Right.
He was just dying to have to, use this stuff. And so he created the situation. We've talked about that before.
Yeah. And I guess the question that comes up or that I can imagine folks wonder is, do you have a duty to render aid in that situation? Let's say I find myself in a self-defense situation. I stop the threat. I have one of these trauma kits. Does the law impose a duty on me to attempt to save their life?
Yeah, generally no.
No.
And only very few people in very specific circumstances have a duty to render aid.
But other side, double-edged sword here, you have no duty to render aid. You do have this trauma kit. You don't render aid. What do you see a prosecutor saying about that?
That's where prosecutors are very sneaky because they're going to say, you had a trauma kit on you. You could have helped them and you didn't because you wanted them to die, right? Remember, if you are involved in a self-defense shooting, you can do nothing right in the eyes of the prosecutor, right? Let's hearken all the way back to 2021 at this point. I'm thinking about Kyle Rittenhouse.
Right.
He had Full Metal Jacket, right? Ammunition. And they made that into like the biggest scary bugaboo in the entire world. Where
Right.
like, we've seen it the opposite way too. You have hollow point ammunition. That's the worst, craziest thing you could possibly do. It doesn't matter what you do. It is going to be used against you. So yes, double-edged sword. You render aid. I think there are great arguments. Well, not great, but there are feasible arguments from the prosecution that basically you're guilty because you did that.
Right.
You have a trauma kit on you and you could have rendered aid and you did not. Well, you are, a heartless maniac who wanted the person to die. And you were equipped to render aid and you chose not to, right?
Yeah, I would say the takeaway, and we see this with function-enhancing modifications to firearms and non-function-enhancing modifications to firearms, it's when you have something out of the ordinary. I'd say most folks don't carry a trauma kit with them every single day. And so when you see something a little bit out of the ordinary, there's a tendency for prosecutors and juries to just kind of latch onto this stuff, even though it might be the responsible thing to do.
Exactly right. And that's really the sad part is that, is it responsible to carry a trauma kit? Yes.
Yeah.
I would agree. But again, would I advise my clients who are just out there in the world to carry it just in anticipation of a self-defense event? No, absolutely not. I don't want that to be something that the jury latches onto.
Yeah.
You're right.
I think probably range bag appropriate.
Range bag appropriate.
Vehicle.
Vehicle appropriate.
Yeah, vehicle appropriate.
Don't put it in your backpack and carry it around with you.
Yeah.
There, I said it. No, I said it.
Well, but I do think, and then fundamentally, I think it makes a huge difference between, let's say you administer a trauma kit, you save a life, and you end up getting charged with a crime, and the prosecutor tries to drag you through the mud for all of this stuff. There's a humongous difference legally between someone who has died and someone who has just suffered serious bodily injury.
There is. And that's where, you kind of, again, I don't know that I want you rendering aid, but I always hope that the person doesn't die.
Right.
And you will hear lawyers say different things. There are lawyers who say, well, one story is one story and that's way better than two stories. And so shoot them where it counts. I will say I have had clients where it's a really good thing that guy died because the story that was going to come out of his mouth was really bad for us, right? I know it's heartless, but that's who we are. But
that's who we are.
At the same time, it's like when the person doesn't die, there's so much more on the table. The prosecution is so much more willing to dismiss a case, to reduce a case. Remember that in many states, if you are convicted of murder, there's no such thing as probation.
Right.
No, you're going to prison. Whereas if you're convicted of an offense such as aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, probation is an option. You might not go to prison for that offense. So it is, again, I think reasonable attorneys can disagree as to whether or not they prefer the person as the decedent or the complainant. But I'd say, alive is better.
Yeah. And then the last thing comes up that I think is worth discussing, but I don't think it's something folks should lose sleep over, is kind of the tampering with evidence considerations that come up in these contexts. Tampering with evidence means a little bit something different in every single state, but essentially it's knowing that an investigation or official proceeding is in progress, manipulating the physical evidence of the scene, or concealing evidence, destroying evidence, those types of things. So, say you stop the threat, you make that decision, hey, you know what, I'm going to go try to save the person that just tried to kill me for whatever reason. Would administering a sucking chest seal or hacking or putting on a tourniquet, would that be, do you think, tampering?
I don't think so. I don't see a state of the world in which you get charged for tampering with that. I mean, it's just so different than eating your drugs before
that's really what it's
your
for.
window, right? I mean, that's what tampering with evidence is really for. No, I don't think so. But that's actually, we had a question of that nature come up in our comments, which is why we're doing this video. Because it is a very interesting question. I don't see it happening. And in part, I don't see it happening because in the civil side, which we haven't really talked about before, which every civil attorney will tell you, again, it's better the guy is alive than dead because there are just fewer damages. Ultimately, a dead body has a much higher price tag than a guy who, his arm doesn't work that well anymore.
Right.
That just is what it is.
Yeah, it's not communist China where, I don't know if you've heard this story, but there, if you injure someone, you're basically on the hook for life to take care of that person's medical bills, whereas if the person dies, it's a one-time payment. So in China, you have the exact...
different.
Exact. That's not the case here in the United States. It is much more expensive to deal with a person who has died than someone who has an injury.
Correct. And so in the civil system, you have a duty to mitigate your damages. So, ideally in the civil system, you should go over and you should try to keep the person from being further injured because that is going to lessen the amount of money you owe. And that's one of the reasons why I don't see this tampering with evidence kind of just, it really is in direct contradiction to something that would be encouraged in the civil law.
Right.
Again, I would say, as criminal practitioners, we're going to say, don't go mitigate your damages. Let the civil attorney deal with that later. You might, hopefully you don't owe any money at all because it was a justified self-defense incident and you have protections in your state. But let the civil attorneys deal with that. We don't want you going over to render aid to the bad guy.
No. So range bag, vehicle, if you're a first responder, maybe on your person. Otherwise, probably a bad idea.
I'm just going to go on and say a bad idea.
But I want to hear what y'all have to say. And if you enjoyed this discussion, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and help us fight the anti-2A algorithm by sharing this video.
And please comment below. Let me know if you think I'm wrong. Let us know if you choose to carry a trauma kit and why. Until next time, we're the Armed Attorneys.